Good evening, friends. We are continuing our wonderful study of this book, In Divine Friendship. We're actually a little more than halfway through, and we're in the middle of this extremely interesting letter about chanting. And so we'll start with chanting. Doesn't that seem like just what we should do? So let's begin with a prayer. Then Keshava will do a couple of chants for us. We'll meditate, and then we'll start. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune ourselves to your living presence. Our prayer is always the same. Guide us, bless us, fill us with your love. Lift us out of this confusion of delusion, that we may see ourselves and our world and our lives as it really is, which is an expression of your presence. Awaken us, awaken us, awaken us to your love. Om, peace. Amen.
dissolve in the sea. I am the bubble, make me the sea. I am the bubble, make me the sea. Make me the sea, oh make me the sea. Make me the sea, oh make me the sea. A wave of the sea, dissolve in the sea. A wave of the sea, dissolve in the sea. Oh, I
peace. Amen. All right, my friends. I spoke at great length about the context for this letter that we're presently reading in our last session, so I'm not going to repeat everything. This letter was written in August of 1998. It was a serious correction that Swami offered for the fact that he felt we were becoming too focused on Indian chants, and that wasn't really what Master wanted. So I'm just gonna pick it up as if you all know, because it's too much to repeat it. But I did not mark where I was in the letter, so I have to figure it out. Okay. Just make sure. I'm going to just have to guess, my friends. And if it comes back to me that we've already done it, I think we'll be all right. I was derelict. It was my mistake. I usually have to write it. You see, I do so many programs during the course. Between the last time I did this one, I've done all these morning broadcasts. I've done a Sunday service. I was honored to be invited to help celebrate Eastern Russian Orthodox Easter, which was actually just this past weekend. So I was able to share about Easter for a second time because I love Easter. So I got to do it twice this year. But all of that for the moment is driven out of my head where we ended on this one. I think we're here. He talks about how he doesn't like the chords that many people do because chords are like language. I think that's where we went. How much should we use chords? That's the next question. You'll notice that in my album, Kriyananda Sings Yogananda, I hardly use them at all. I chant much more in the style Master used. At the same time, this album is more for individual singing than for large groups, and therefore doesn't even try to be rhythmic. You know, when you're all by yourself, you can just take the melody any way you feel it. But if you're with a group of people, they have to be able to anticipate what you're going to do. And it's sometimes when singers are too good as singers, they're not as good as at leaders of a group because they follow their own inspiration so freely. The rest of the group just has to enjoy their singing, but you can't really sing with them. But when Swami chants on that album, he's entirely alone and there's no need. It is just for us to share his inspiration. Back to the question of chords then, I'd say don't feel that chords are essential to our chanting. These are all directional issues. Somebody really realized, oh, we could play chords, and then all of a sudden everybody's playing chords, and all of a sudden people begin to think we have to play chords. Because this is how dogmas get developed. Somebody just starts something and then everybody thinks it's the way it's supposed to be done. I used to joke for years before many of us had, I'm going like this because we had these plastic, they still make them plastic earplugs that are sort of like little torpedoes with little layers on them. And you can plug the two earplugs into your ears and it's nice. And some of them come with a cord. So when you're not wearing it, you can hang it around your neck and then you can pick them in. And they're designed for construction workers and people who are working in noisy places. They put them in, then they pull them out, so they wear them around their neck. I've always had this image in my mind that there would be ancient tattered photographs of early Kriyabans, which is us, and we'd be wearing this string around our neck with this little torpedo-shaped thing with ruffles on it. And pretty soon, centuries from now, you know, one of the sacred items that the priest would always put on would be this sort of gold-plated little thing around his neck with these little baffles. And you don't, when you're pioneering something, you actually have to think much more carefully about what you're doing, because we really are setting a tone. And those of us, Swami was with Master and we were with Swami. So there's an assumption that the things that we're doing are reflective of what they wanted, and to a large extent they are, but odd things can creep in. In our Sundays, on our Sunday program now, we often, well, especially before COVID started, but it is our pattern. At 9 o'clock, we have a fire ceremony, and then we have the purification ceremony, and then some time for meditation. It's a 45-minute segment or so that happens there. Well, putting the fire ceremony in there was just a really good idea that some of us had. It wasn't lo, Master appeared in our temple and said, start the fire ceremony at 9. It just seemed like a natural adjunct to the purification ceremony, and Swami thought it was a really nice idea. And I'm not exactly sure how it developed, but we started doing the fire ceremony with 2 light bearers standing by the fire bowl, and everyone stood up while we did it. So it became that you stood up for the fire ceremony. Well, I tend to be a rebel, and the times that I was in the congregation, when I have the pleasure of not leading the service, I tend to just sit in my chair and not move, just because I'm so delighted not to have a responsibility. I like to just immerse myself in it, and I find that I can concentrate on the fire ceremony and the mantras better sitting down than standing up. It's 10 minutes to stand up, and I don't particularly want to. And my justification for not doing that is that it was Swamiji who introduced us to the fire ceremony, and when it all began, now I know I'm talking ancient history, this is in the 70s, we were at Ananda's seclusion retreat, meditation retreat, and they had dug a sort of very small amphitheater, and Swami would sit at the lowest level, and then there were 2 layers of just literally, just dug out of the clay, like a tiny little stadium that we sat in. And we all sat, and Swami sat. And very often pujaris in India who are doing fire ceremonies are sitting right next to the fire because they're putting lots of offerings in, and it's often a very long service. So I didn't feel like I'm being unorthodox by sitting down. But I can see that the tradition has become that you stand up for the fire ceremony. Now, somebody can correct me if I'm completely wrong in this, but I don't think there is one. And so every time I do it, I always tell people, feel free to sit if you like. Now, you can see better when you're standing, and people may feel more dynamic when they're standing. It's totally. And in other ceremonies, when we do a fire ceremony, people do stand up for it. So it's not like you don't have to. But the end of all of this is, it's very easy for something to be done a few times, and then people begin to decide it's the way it's done. And everybody looks around. And so Swami's, the idea of playing chords has sort of come in, partly because we're using guitars, but Master didn't play chords. Master just played the melody. And when Swami, sings for himself, he just plays the melody. So chords are nice. Not all chords are nice, but they're not essential. That's not where the heart of the chant is. To my mind, it's like we can make any kind of decisions that we feel are appropriate, but I always like to keep track of where they came from, of what it's about, because I've been living in this colony for so many years, and a lot of what developed here, I was here while it developed, and sometimes I'm the keeper of the memory. Now, I'm not the only one who knows things, especially when it comes to Swamiji. One of the most fun conversations I have with my peers, with my tribe, as I sometimes call it, sort of my generation of Ananda, is that Swamiji said so many different things to so many different ones of us. So it's not like this is what he said. It's like, well, this is what he said to you in that circumstance. This is what he said to me in this circumstance. Just recently, I had a very wonderful conversation with a friend and 2 friends, and we were just talking about some important issues in regard to the responsibilities we carry with Ananda. And it was just absolutely lovely that, they and I have made completely opposite choices on a number of very important issues, all of it based on direct experience and input from Swami. And so, which one was entirely true? Well, both and. And the death of revelation is when it becomes religion. And the death of religion in the West is when it becomes, this is what it is and that is what it is not. Because true teaching is individual. So here we are again. Back to the question of chords, then I'd say don't feel that chords are essential to our chanting. So he makes it very clear. They're not essential. Melody is what's essential. People who find chords easier to play and who therefore skimp on playing the melody or omit it altogether ought to try to learn to play the melodies and to play them correctly. It isn't enough only to sing them. The practice of playing chords without melody is getting too far away from Master's style of chanting. See, everything always has to come back. What did Master do? And then Swamiji is just wonderful with us in helping us not merely know what was done, but why it was done. What was the reasoning behind it? Swamiji just wonderfully through the years, he constantly shares not just the conclusion, but the process that he used to arrive at that. And he says, does he say it here? Let me think about it. I think he said it earlier. There are two ways of expressing emotion musically, melody, three ways, melody, chords, and rhythm. And so he says in another place, aspiration is expressed through melody. I don't think it's in this letter, but elsewhere he says, and one of the characteristics of our particular culture is that music is now being called music without melody, because we don't have, as a society, we've lost aspiration. We've lost our connection with the upward movement of energy and the expansive, the spiritually expansive goal of life. So we're just interested in experience, and we don't have a clear idea of where we're trying to go with those experiences. So gradually our music is losing melody. I mean, and even now there's music that just simply has none. It just has no melody. Or the melody isn't uplifting, isn't inspiring. It doesn't go anywhere because people pride themselves on just having experiences and not having direction. It was my nightmare growing up, that I was having lots of experiences and I didn't know where they were going. So melody is really where Master's consciousness is really expressed. And that's why he emphasized it. Secondly, it would help, as you get deeper into a chant, to get away from playing the chords altogether and concentrate entirely on the melody. Through the melody, you'll find it easier to attune yourself to Om than you will by continuing to emphasize the emotional feelings awakened by chords. Well, he's really talking, and this is the rest of what he talks about, is what is the purpose of chanting? What is the true purpose of chanting that we mustn't lose sight of in our exuberance for other aspects of what it can bring us. So he said, go from outer exuberance to quiet absorption within. It would be nice to have the Indian drums that are played from the sides, the mridanga and the dholak, for example, rather than from above like the Indian tablas. The tablas require considerable sophistication to sound good, and even with sophistication, they often sound as if they were in competition with the singing. In my album called, I think, Songs of the Soul, Keshav Das' son Murli, Keshav Das was a wonderful Indian spiritual teacher, and he taught a lot through music beautifully, and his young son Murli played the tabla accompaniment and played it exceedingly well. And this is, unfortunately, this album is very frustrating for the reasons Swami's going to describe. He played it, however, with personal style and in competition with the singing, not in support of it. And really, for that reason, the album is very disappointing. In fact, someone asked him later how the chanting sessions had gone, and he replied, very well, I played such and such a tala, such a rhythm, meaning that his concept of what he was doing was what he was doing. And unfortunately, it shows in the combination. He plays very well, but he didn't play for the singing. The tabla ends up being in competition, exactly what Swami says. So he's talking about the difficulty of adding drum. The drum has to be brought in the right way. Lewis, a gentleman who lives at Ananda Village, who's a very, very good musician, Lewis plays the tabla sensitively and also well, but we can't have him for every chant session. And I think the tabla is in any case right only for certain chants, not for all even of the rhythmic ones. The mridanga, dolak, and other similar instruments played from the side are easier to play and are in most cases more natural for chanting than the tablas. So Swami's going into the whole situation here. Last week we talked about, I remember now, last week we talked about the language of music being as exact as verbal language. And not all of us can speak music as well as Swami can speak it. So he will hear and feel things and nuances of meaning that not everyone will feel. But fortunately we have him to make those observations and make those comments. And then we have to integrate them according to our understanding and our capacity to carry them out. But guitars can be great also, if not overemphasized. Stronger strumming at the beginning of a chant session can yield to gentle finger picking as the chanting gets deeper. Outward exuberance should be replaced gradually by inward depth. Sankirtan should include short, Sankirtan means sessions of chanting, should include short, then long, and then gradually longer periods of meditation. The purpose of all chanting is to take us inside, not to keep us shouting out loud to God. So this again is, he's wanting us not to forget what we're really doing. Most Indian chanting is a recitation of names of God with an occasional Namo thrown in. It's sort of a humorous way to put it, but that is, if you're not familiar with the words, that's how it sounds. Are all those names really meaningful to any of us? We haven't grown up with them. They aren't part of our culture, nor of the way we think. I was asked recently in an interview, to which Hindu symbols do you feel most attracted? I had to answer, to none of them particularly. I'm a yogi. Symbols are for people who feel more drawn to the outward aspects of religion. Ooh, now there's something, isn't it? All of the deities and so on. And here's the point. Master, too, placed minimal importance on deities, symbols, etc. You know, when we first started going to India and everybody was doing pujas and had murtis, which are the statues, and just all of these ways of doing it, it was a little confusing for us as Westerners, as disciples of an Indian master. I mean, I'm talking about our first, our really early trips in the late 80s. It was like, have we missed something here? Is there some big piece of this that we have neglected to follow? And we sort of came back to talk to Swami about it, and he reminded us that Master was perfectly familiar with all those things. And many of the Indian teachers who came to the West brought with them those deities and those symbols and those rituals and those pujas. And I mean, they're wonderful. There's nothing, there's nothing not to love, but it simply wasn't the ray of grace that Master brought. And so as disciples, if we're going to be disciples, we have to tune in to what it is our gurus are asking of us, and we have to cooperate with them as their disciples, and we also have to, it's not just a question of obedience, it's a question of trying more deeply to understand, why would he do it this way? Why would he choose this? What was his intention? Sometimes when over the years with Swamiji, I wouldn't always, especially at first, agree with everything he said. I talked about that last week in the context of this very thing. But I learned to work with him better when, instead of just asking, what did he do? what was Swami suggesting? What did he want? Or so on like that. I would ask myself, what is he trying to accomplish? And when I tuned in to what he was trying to accomplish, either what he was doing made more sense to me, or sometimes I could be more creative and more helpful in moving us toward that goal, if instead of nitpicking about the details, I asked, what is he trying to accomplish? So if Master chose not to bring those symbols, why would he have done that? And I don't mean that as an accusatory question, just why would he have done that? What was his mission? And this is the way we can take the example and the actions and the decisions of the saints and the masters and use them to expand our own understanding and awareness. Yes, it's good to cooperate and it's good to be obedient with true authority, but even that obedience needs to be intelligent obedience. It's not just a question of, well, you say so, so I'll do it. It's a question of, what are you trying to accomplish? And I found that to be the most useful question. What are you trying to accomplish? With this whole letter, what Swami's trying to accomplish is he felt we were becoming just simply too outward. And we were really missing the whole point of why we were chanting. And again, Swami could see how directions get set and those directions just carry. And pretty soon, the first group that takes a certain direction might be able to hold all sides of it, but the second group is going to be more distant and the third even farther. So he felt he really had to issue a corrective at this point. Master, too, placed minimal importance on deities, symbols, etc. As his disciples, I think we ought to recognize that many of those Indian chants, most of the names in which aren't even recognizable to us, are more a means of letting off emotional steam than of really deepening our devotion. Forgive me if I offend. I didn't mean to. But that's how he felt. And he listened to it, so he knew. I want also to say, let's be careful that we select chants that uplift us, not those merely that stir us with sweet sentiments. Let us try to use them as a means of internalizing our consciousness. In other words, as a path to God. Let us realize that even in India, much of the chanting is not inspiring, but mostly just makes a lot of noise. I remember a story about a time Sri Ramakrishna and some of his disciples attended a Vaishnava festival and found the music dispirited. So, this is Ramakrishna, a great avatar, and even he finds that the music isn't really taking us where we need to go. You see, the human mind, this is the problem with delusion. This is what Swami said, we were Westerners, we were raised on emotional music. It's only natural that we would be attracted to emotional music. Many Indians were trained and raised on kirtan, on spiritual songs. That's not, especially not now, but that's more how it used to be. But we were raised on very emotional music, romantic music, and like that. So it has the familial warmth to it for us. So Swami's just really wanting us to say, don't be fooled just because the words are exotic to us. Let's pay attention to the true vibration. Let's try our best to follow Master's way and to tune into the divine ray he has brought into our lives. The more we do so, the faster we'll all grow spiritually. And Swami says in Divine Friendship. So, now the next few letters are a couple of letters that just sort of deal with the feedback that he got on this original letter. So this is August 17th, 1998. Let's see, when was this first one written? This was August 2nd, so now a little more than 2 weeks later. Swami has issued a letter again to all of us. Dear ones, my recent letter on chanting was intended as a corrective. I've had feedback on the Indian chants, and I must say I love some of them too. I've been listening. When Swami was in India for 4 years, he learned many Indian chants. He learned some of Master's chants in Bengali, and he learned Indian devotional songs, and he sang them quite often and quite beautifully. So he had a great attunement with it. It's not a cultural thing that he was talking about. What would be wrong in this context, would be whole evenings devoted only to Indian chanting when we have our own, masters especially. But to sing the Indian chants now and then, interspersed between our own, would add to the inspiration rather than deflect it in a different and not necessarily yogic or not yoganandic direction. What I'm for and what I myself have sung are those that are simple and easy to understand. Too many names only leave people feeling bemused as to what on earth they are singing. I remember one of our visitors said, this was long before this was like in the 70s when we used to do more. He said he never really quite knew what the words were, but he found the phrase yogurt teacup really fit in nicely. It was an extreme solution, but that was sort of how he solved the problem. This is not quite about chanting, but it's just how languages get confused. Let's see. This little girl, this actually happened. This little girl, her mother had been visiting a lot of different churches, and she started coming to our temple here, and she really enjoyed it. We had a Sunday school, and she came and told us she'd been bringing her daughter for a few weeks. Her daughter was 6 or 7. And she overheard her daughter saying to friend, "Mommy's taking me to a new church, and now we believe in Parmesan Yugoslavia." That was how she heard Paramhansa Yogananda. She put in the only word she could understand. I love the phrase that we now believe in Parmesan Yugoslavia. So that's an extreme example from the mouth of a babe. But Swami has a point. We often really don't know what those words mean. Too many names only leave people feeling bemused as to what on earth they are singing. It may feel good, but they don't know what it's all about. You know, also in that same context, so many of Swamiji's chants are so beautiful, and Master's chants too. The melodies, of course, but even the words. For the Festival of Light, Swami, for the Arati song, he took a melody, and the words to the melody were Sri Ram Jai Ram, and Ram is the name of God, you know, Lord, victory to God. It's a beautiful, simple meaning, beautiful chant, and it was a traditional melody. But Swami wrote, all desires, you know, let's see, now I'm going to forget it, but it has words like, you know, all my desires, here I lay them at your feet, Lord. You know, this is, and it's a whole prayer, a beautiful prayer about, oh, Father, Mother, Friend, our God. Oddly, I can't even remember it. I've been singing it for 30 years. It'll come back to me in a moment. But it's just, here I lay, Lord, everything that I am. And every time I sing that, I love the Sri Ram words to that same melody, but I don't feel and hear as much when I'm just saying Sri Ram Jai Ram as I say, Lord, all desires born of delusion, here I lay at thy feet. And then it goes on, there's another verse or two. Odd, I can't remember, but it's the Arati song for the Festival of Light. Last Sunday at the Festival of Light, a couple of times my brain just went completely blank. I don't know if it's age-related dementia creeping in or just taking a holiday. At the moment I seem to be taking a holiday from remembering what those words are. Okay. So, but that's also true, and I do love the Indian chants. But that's a really interesting example, because sometimes I hear it sung Sri Ram, Jai Ram, which I love, and I know what it means. But it doesn't mean as much to me as when I sing the rest of the words. So that's just something to think about. I'm not saying that's your definitive experience. I'm just saying that is an experience to consider. Let's see. I also recommend strongly that we avoid those chants that have complex rhythmic and melodic patterns. They seem to me too mentally involving, at least for Westerners, to awaken real devotion. Meaning, if you're not a really good singer, or have a really good mind, for that, the words and the language. You just have to think about it all the time. So you're not able to just really surrender to the flow, because you're always having to keep track of as to what verse we're on, and you know what the melody is. If you're raised in it, it's quite different than if you're trying to learn it from the outside. I've spoken with Nirmala, who's one of the chanters and musicians that Swami worked closely with a great deal. She was part of his creative team. I've spoken with Nirmala, who just got out our chant book. We thought to have a separate little book of Indian chants. I suggested we keep their number below 10, and preferably not more than 8, so that people really do think of these as occasional insertions into our own chanting, rather than making a whole evening of them. That number, of course, is one I just pulled out of the air. I don't mean it necessarily to be fixed, but limited, yes. I don't feel that Master opposes this decision. It isn't what he himself did, but as I wrote in my last letter on chanting, we are, meaning to include even those 8 or 10 Indian chants. And I also like the way Swami says this. I don't feel that Master opposes this decision to include a lot of Indian chants. Swami was very, very careful about invoking Master's name. He never did it casually. He never used it to bolster his own position. He used it only when it was part of helping us understand how he came to a conclusion. Because you could easily get quite dogmatic the other way. Master didn't do Indian chants. Why are we doing any Indian chants? And so Swami's suggesting we have a handful of them. I don't feel that Master would oppose this. He said, it isn't what he himself did, but as I wrote in my letter on chanting, we are much more exposed to this kind of chanting now than Westerners were in his day. People have learned to love it, and I don't want to deprive them of something that inspires them, so long as it doesn't take them in a different direction from what Master gave us. So you see how subtle he's being? Like, he had to really issue a corrective. We were going in a direction he didn't feel was right for us. He had to sort of stand in front of the train and stop it and push it in another way. And as I said last week, I myself was not so helpful to him for a long time. Now I look at it and I understand it. At the time I resisted. I accepted, but I also resisted. But here he's also just being he's explaining to us. I don't think Master would be against it. Times have changed a little bit since Master's time. When he came, he was the only Indian, virtually, the only Indian teacher around. The cross-cultural things that have become so normal to us, they just weren't happening at all. He was exceedingly unusual and exotic in the context. Everything about India and him as an Indian and the Indian culture, it was all very, very new to people. Now it's just common. So he also he wanted to avoid any inference that he was just here to impose his culture on the West. He very much said, I came to spiritualize your own culture. He came representing the original teachings of Jesus, and original teachings of Krishna. And if he had emphasized the Indian chanting, where would Jesus have fit in on that? But nowadays, that understanding is much more sophisticated, even then, which was 30 years ago, when Swami wrote this. So he's just, many people have love Indian chanting. You're inspired by it. And he's implying there you're genuinely inspired by it. You're not doing all the things that he was saying could happen. Just it being an emotional outlet, just being noise without knowing what you're doing. You're genuinely inspired, and I don't want to take that away from you, but I don't want it to derail us either. So this is, again, this is about chanting, but this is also every time we have to make a decision where we have to intuit for ourselves, either for your personal life or for Ananda, what is it that we're supposed to do? These letters are a treasure trove of directions for how to be a good disciple, which is, of course, all we're trying to be here. And that's what Swami came to show us. He was always a disciple. He was always a disciple before and after everything else that he was. And he's trying to train us in how to do that. The role of disciples is not to repeat parrot-like exactly what the Guru said and did, but to absorb it and offer it with individual understanding rooted in inner attunement. I'm going to say that again. The role of disciples is not to repeat parrot-like exactly what the Guru said and did, but to absorb it and offer it with individual understanding rooted in inner attunement. That's just what it is. I'm always thinking about what Swami did, what he said, how he handled it. I wouldn't know any other way to run my life. But I try to do it exactly as he said it. I'm not just parroting it, I'm trying really to understand it. And then in new circumstances, intuition will come. In the same spirit, I recommended to Nirmala a slight change in the way Master himself sang Spirit and Nature. So this is in the same spirit of inner attunement and real understanding. You know the one, Radhe, 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 Govinda's spirit and nature dancing together. Victory to spirit and victory to nature. That's how Master had it. Incidentally, it's Radhe, not Radha, as I believe it's still written in cosmic chants. Radha is her name, but Radhe is the vocative form, used when invoking her response. Vocative is a word I don't know, but I suppose it means invoking. So Radhe, Radhe, Radhe Govinda Jaya, repeated again. Spirit and nature dancing together. Then Master had the line, victory to spirit, victory to nature. But he did this spontaneously in the context of the story of Sri Chaitanya's life. Chaitanya was a great devotee. It is, in fact, what the word Jaya means in Sanskrit and in other Indian languages. Swami also says, he tells us that Cosmic Chants was not, the book Cosmic Chants is published by Self-Realization Fellowship, and it's Master's, the chants that Master wrote, written in rhythm with exact melody and notes. Swami said that Master often did the chants differently. From time to time, not radically differently, but he would give different rhythms, sometimes, even slight differences in the melody. That book was created, and Swami was in SRF at the time it was created. It was created afterwards by a very good musician, and decisions had to be made because it was necessary to create a songbook. And so sometimes among various choices that Master made, certain choices were selected as being the most representative, the most commonly used. There's no complaint about that, but when you know the backstory, just what I was saying earlier about how things happen, you can sort of see the point at which there was more than one choice. And if one disciple made one choice, another disciple might make another choice. And be consistent because it comes from inner understanding and personal attunement. And that's what I was saying earlier, how a lot of times I have conversations with my spiritual brothers and sisters of the same generation that we grew up together with Swamiji. And it's just very impressive. Not merely that we have different recollections of things or different understanding, but we have very different input. Swamiji will have guided one of us one way and another way. And we just have to make decisions on this. So Swami's making a change in this chant, but he remembers that when Master said victory to spirit and victory to nature, it was, as he said, spontaneously. It wasn't like he sat down and wrote it out with a pen. It was in the course of telling the story. It was the right way to say it. So he said, and Jaya means victory. So Master was just translating it into English. But victory isn't anything we ourselves say in English in this context. Jai is what you say in India, and Swami, he's going to explain it here. For us, victory means winning against opposition, not, as he puts it, up with, as it does in Sanskrit, meaning, let us raise up, hooray. We ourselves say things like, long live, or hooray. Expressions, in other words, that work for us in other circumstances, but not really in the present case. you would say Jai Yogananda, and victory to Yogananda is how that would translate. But what that really means is hooray, hooray, long live, bravo. And victory is a slightly different word. I only speak one language, but of course, this is what everybody talks about when they're translating, especially I'm told, because English has so many different words, more words than many other languages, and very fine nuances, because some of the people who do translating have sometimes asked me, to help them with different phrases in Swami's books or the autobiography, or now in Light Bear, some of the things that I've done. They just end up telling me, we can't say it in Italian. We can't say that in Spanish. There's just no way to say that. So we have to come together and figure out, what can we say and how can we say it. I mean, in Italian, for example, just for fun, I'll tell you, I always called Swami Kriyananda, I always called him Swamiji. Swamiji is affection and respect, is what we all called him. But I also always often called him Sir. So there was a certain familiarity implied by the Swamiji part, but the Sir kept a certain formality with him because I always felt that way. But I was completely at ease with Swamiji. He was my best friend, and I just spoke to him like my father. It was not a relationship of distance, it was a relationship of closeness. I had long discussions with both Shivani, who's American but speaks fluent Italian, and Sahaja, who is Italian and speaks fluent Italian but has done all the translating from English, so she's also extremely adept at English, trying to figure out a way to do that in Italian, to be both familiar and have that kind of respect. Because in Italian, it's done with the verb tenses. And you have familiar tenses and you have formal tenses, like you also have in Spanish, which I know not at all, but enough to know that. And we finally just came to the point where we just couldn't do it. There wasn't the equivalent. The language reflected the culture, and there wasn't the equivalent. And because at first, then she wanted to use the formal forms of the verbs, but I said that wouldn't be accurate. It wouldn't look right, because that's not my relationship with Swami. She might put a little footnote in there. The book hasn't come out yet, or else we just gave it up, decided it just couldn't be done. So when you start going from one language to the next, that's why I'm saying all of this, you run into all these nuances. So anyway, so Master said, victory to spirit, victory to nature. And then Swami says, we say things like long live or hurrah, expressions, in other words, that work for us in other circumstances, but not really in the present tense. We can't really say hurrah for spirit, hurrah for nature. Doesn't make sense. So here's Swami's suggestion. Bliss in the spirit and bliss through all nature. That's not a literal translation of Jaya, but it conveys the spirit of that word. So isn't that interesting? So he rewrote that chant a little bit. Again, I plead with you, let's use these Indian chants more intermittently. They're beautiful, and I too love them. But let's think of them as spicing rather than the main course. Love. You can read a lot. As I said, I was also part of the reaction to that. So then now we have one more letter. This was written on August 7th. He wrote the first letter on August 2nd. What I just read was August 17th. This came in between. This is to an individual. I don't know who, but it wasn't to everyone. The one I just read was to everyone. So, dear whoever, it seems to me I've said enough. Excuse me, let me give you the summary. Swamiji emphasizes the directional nature of his statement on chanting. That was how Swami always wanted us to understand. Things are not dogmatic, they're just pointing us where he wants us to go. It seems to me I've said enough. Swami starts his letter. I don't know what kind of a letter he got. Still, let me add, or is it repeat, Just this thought that to insist on a 180-degree turn usually results in either halted or discouraged energy. We don't want that. Therefore, I speak in terms of directions. You might tell one person that too, and another person who inclines happily toward the 180-degree corrections without taking into account that few others are happy with drastic measures. Isn't that fun? So there it is again. Swami has spoken. Now we're going to do it like this. And then Swami just says, oh no, that's not what I want. It's not what I ever want. So he said, you might tell these people who incline happily toward 180-degree turns. Some people really like, now we have our instructions, now we know what to do. And they resonate with that kind of energy. You might say they're not taking into account that if you clamp down that heavily, you have energy moving in a certain direction and you just stop it, then it discourages people. It does not lead to more expansion. It leads to contractive energy. Swami goes on with this. If people find inspiration in what they are now doing, go with it. Your own desire to go Master's way will find the right means of improving the situation gradually as the possibility arises. It's never good to be drastic, especially about changing what seems to be a good thing anyway. See, that was sort of the position that I was in. Like we had a lot of wonderful kirtan going on, and it was a lot of Indian chants, and it was a very positive energy. And I didn't want to stop that positive energy. It was a complicated question. And Swami himself, if you have a good thing going, don't just slam the door on it, because now Swami has said, try to tune into what he's trying to accomplish, and then see how you can cooperate with that. When things are spelled out too carefully, the whole point of what is trying to happen gets lost. Now see, that's the whole thing. When things are spelled out too carefully, it doesn't leave room for intuition, it doesn't leave room for inspiration. It's just, this is how it's done. And that's the disaster. And Swami, that's why he uses the word directional. This is the problem. He explains it very carefully. This is what I see as a good solution. Now, we have to think, how do we keep the good energy we have going, rather than just slam the door and replace it with nothing? Because people haven't grown into this new idea. And so when you spell things out too carefully, we'll do 16 minutes of this, and then 2 minutes of that, and then this particular thing, and then that. I mean, there's no flow, there's no inspiration, there's no, what does the moment require in that? That's not really the best way to do things. Be guided simply by your inner feelings, he said. To a certain extent, the problem you voice is similar to someone else's reading of the Hindu way of awakening. He is offended, though he says he likes the book, that I haven't put in enough qualifying clauses about the good, fine, noble, wise, etc., people who are into the mystical side of Christianity, or not into the institutional side, or whatever else he wants to take issue with, that would have made that book impossibly long, impossibly dry, with so many qualifications, and impossibly dim 1 horsepower energy. I think earlier in this book we talked about the Hindu way of awakening. It was probably the same thing. Swami says he describes things, he doesn't generalize, but he describes things according to their essential nature. And if you're going to make a point, if you're going to get people to respond and to change and to lift their energy and to see a new reality, you have to do it with strength. You can't do it by saying, this is, this is the truth of this is the ideal of this situation, but then, of course, on the other hand, there's also other points of view, and that we know lots of people might not agree with us. And even though that I say that this is really not very inspiring, for some people it is very inspiring, and I always want to allow those people to have enough. You just can't do it. And Swami's writing The Hindu Way of Awakening. He's talking about institutional religion. He's talking about the inner reality. He's talking about how institutional religion has gotten lost in the forms and has forgotten the essence. Yes, perhaps not every single Christian, every person who's in the Christian church has done that, but the essential reality is that it's become an institution. And good for the people within it who are working in another direction. But you have to take a stand. So I'd like to write to him, though I don't know whether I will, and tell him, can't you see that if all those wonderful people are in our camp, then they're the ones I am writing with, not against. We share the same point of view. Why on earth be offended on their behalf? Why are you trying to protect always over here? You have to take a stand. And this, Swami had this all through his life. And he would take stands and he would just hold them. But he was totally non-judgmental, forgiving, and he welcomed anyone who wanted to be with him. He wasn't trying to polarize, he was trying to clarify. And if there's people who share his point of view, as he said it just perfectly, I'm not against them. But I'm afraid that man prefers the kind of writing that qualifies, then requalifies each tiny thought. To write his kind of book, I couldn't have got past the contents of chapter 1. I'd have needed 300 pages just to say that much. I mean, this is how a lot of people write. A lot of academic writing has to answer every possible objection. That's just not who Swami is. And we have really dealt with this in earlier letters. I write with a broad brush, Swami says. Why not take it as a direction instead of a directive? Grow into it. I haven't time to work out all the hows and whereases. You all work it out. I'm not running the community now. You all decide if you like what I say or not. So Swami's also, a degree of impatience, which is exercise your own creativity and your attunement and your intelligence here. I'm not going to spoon feed this to you. I've laid out, and this is again, I've laid out very clearly what I'm trying to accomplish and why, and the general outlines of how I think it should be done. I'm not going to go beyond that. It's up to, that's where Swami even talked about in the whole question of editing Master's writings. Sometimes people would ask, why do they need to be edited at all? And Swami says that Master would write from this just intuitive flow of understanding the higher reality of things, but then Swami would describe it as plumbing. He said to just make all the ideas flow one to the other, to sometimes make logical bridges between the inspirational ideas that Master had, to help people sort of see what goes around it. He said that's the job of the disciple, because the disciple grows from attuning in and doing that. And so Master didn't bring everything to the final polish because his disciples could grow from doing that work. And then he could move on to the next reality, because as Swami he often called it plumbing. He said it operates on a lower level of consciousness. To edit something so that it reads smoothly and dynamically and without contradiction, consistently. He said that's just a lower level than what Master gave in terms of the clarity of insight. And that's what Master did. So here he says, Swami's just saying, I'm just not going to bring it down to that level. It's up to you to figure that out. I must, however, say what I have to say, meaning I have to speak. I owe that to Master. From there on, it's your community, not mine, to run actively anymore. And now he's getting into whoever wrote to him was just trying to, let me think about this for a minute. Because Swami starts this letter, I think I've said what I have to say. I imagine that the letter he got was full of analytical ideas and requests for this and justifications for that, and just wanting Swami to just do every little thing. And Swami had, emphatically, in 1998, he put all of that down. And so Swami's trying to make clear this was not an appropriate request of me. mean, because there's a little bit here that's saying, this was not appropriate. You need to think about this. He's not correcting the individual directly, but he's correcting him indirectly. I must, however, say what I have to say. I owe that to Master. From then on, it's your community, not mine, to run actively anymore. I know it takes time to work on directions, but that has always, in fact, been my particular style of leadership, and it is likely to continue to be my style. Let's just say I'm too old to change. So whatever was being asked of Swamiji, he wanted to make it clear that he was not about to do it. And there's also an implication here that it was an improper request. When I've gotten letters from Swami or words from Swami with that tone in them, it's like, oh, I wasn't paying attention here. I've crossed a line, and I need to rethink what I'm considering. Many times people have disagreed even strongly with what I've said, then have come around to it later in their own time. I certainly am in that number. I'd much rather that than wholehearted agreement followed by silence and inaction. But Swami said he always prefers an honest argument to a mindless yes. So he says the people sometimes who disagree with him think it through. They're expressing their point of view, but they're really trying to understand. He said, I much prefer that than wholehearted agreement, which is just yes or whatever you say. But because they're not connected to it, they just do nothing. I also did that with Swami, learned my way through it. I've no more time to be working things out with you all. You work them out. If you like what I say and find it inconvenient to practice it, I know it will remain in your minds and serve as a constant nudge toward what you know in your hearts must be done. You see that? If you if you like what I say but find it inconvenient to practice, that would be pretty much me. I believed him, I liked it, but it was inconvenient, I didn't want to do it. I know it will remain in your minds and serve as a constant nudge toward what you know in your hearts must be done. I think that was pretty much me. It needn't happen quickly. The important thing is that it be said, heard, and listened to, and then I would hope acted on in some natural timing. So see, once again, look at all the instructions Swami's giving us for the right kind of leadership to make the right kind of community. I mean, people ask me all the times about founding communities, and honestly, all I can say is leadership, leadership, leadership. It's just every entity is an expression of the spirit of the leader. And look how carefully Swami thinks about what he does. He had every right to say, stop doing this, start doing that. And you can make things happen like that. But you don't end up with a community like Ananda. You don't end up with dynamic, self-motivated, individually inspired, creative people like we have. And we have it because of what Swami taught us and how he worked with us, even in a matter this important. Here again, he just says, look, you all have to work it out in a way that is consistent with who we're trying to be. And it's up to you to do that. I've been doing it, Kriyananda says. I've been doing it all these years. I'm done. Yeah, it's not easy. It's complicated. It takes a lot of work. It takes attunement. It takes patience. It takes inspiration. It takes energy. It takes magnetism. What do you think I've been doing for you for the last decades? Now it's your turn. Don't just come back and expect me to fix it. You have to do it. So there was a lot in there. The naturalness of everything is the operative expression, meaning let it spring from the inner understanding that people have. And if they don't have it yet, work to help inspire it in them. So there we are. So here's one more. August 6th, the original letter was August 2nd, responds to other comments on his chanting statement. I'd like to repeat what I said to you yesterday. Don't try for drastic changes. In response to what you heard from people, I don't want to throw out anything, but only to make a gradual shift that won't discourage anybody. Nor do I want the dispirited chanting we used to have. You're right. The dragging was a general feature at Ananda and didn't occur only in my dome or the seclusion retreat dome. Definitely occurred also at the Expanding Light, which is our guest facility. Dragging was when the leader is trying to make something happen and the audience is just slowing down and not tuning in, and it just becomes funereal. Swami wrote about that earlier. Swami was trying to be kind and say maybe it's the distance traveling from the back of the room to the front of the room, but he said it's more than that. It's people's energy level goes down. Let's keep what is good about what we're doing, but not overdo it. Some chords may be helpful. Too much is detrimental. Some guitar is helpful. Too much vigorous strumming is detrimental. The important thing is that if and when we do use chords, that they be the right chords. It is beautiful to have chords for the chants too, when they are being played to listen to instead of to sing to. So then here you get into, can we do instrumental arrangements of the chants with chords? And so Swami's saying, well, that's a whole different situation because we're not also dealing with a voice or a group. As for the ministers, if they feel to lead the chanting, they should do so. If they don't or want help, that's fine. But I myself don't want help on the chanting. Before the service, we often have chanting. Then immediately before the service and during the offertory, we have the choir. For help with the chanting during the service, I'd say let the ministers decide. Well, that was because he was also suggesting that whoever led the service should also lead the chanting. And that was, people had different ideas. I always felt that I was surrounded by people who were so much better than me. I have done it at different times. I used to chant a lot more. I hardly ever do now in public. But I just always felt, well, my own was personal. It was twofold. One, they were much better musicians than I. And the other was just that I especially at that time, I just did so much of everything that I was very happy to just let that go into other hands. And that was directly opposite to what Swami had suggested. But Swami's also saying, act with understanding from your own inspiration. So one more regarding the chanting. It is always best to let new developments insert themselves gradually and naturally into the consciousness of both singers and audience. Otherwise, in this case, there might be a loss of enthusiasm for all forms of chanting, and that would be too bad. It takes time for people to grow into a new idea. Love, Swami. And then one more, and then we'll be done with the subject. Asked for examples of Indian chants that might be used. So Swami says, Hey Bhagavan, which simply means, oh God, and there's a beautiful melody for that one. Sri Ram, Jai Ram, as examples are lovely. Also those with lovely melodies like Sri Krishna Chaitanya. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Swami took the melody of Sri Krishna Chaitanya and wrote, Sri Yogananda, guide to inner freedom, steal into my heart of hearts, banish my delusions. So he took the melody and put English words to it. Many of the more newly incorporated chants, however, even I don't understand, Swami says, and he speaks in several Indian languages, 2 Indian languages, and knows more Sanskrit than we do. My feeling is to cut back by eliminating many of those. The 2 main motivations for singing them seem to be, 1, they are Indian, 2, they are new and different. The motivation that seems lacking in some of them seems to be that of both beauty and inspiration. And everything else I said on the subject seems to me a cogent argument. So that was a big adventure that we all went through together with Swami. And we're, I think, more or less in most of the colonies. Of course, then of course we traveled to India and had a whole different, started establishing a work there, and they go through this whole different reality of needing to translate, they need to translate some of Master's chants into the Indian language and Indian languages, and they also pull up more traditional things, because some of what Swamiji says is true, and some of it is, well, you are dealing with the Indian culture there. And so we're trying to bring the right kind of spirit in. I don't live in India. I've traveled and worked there sometimes, shared there, but I've never lived there. I'm just going to tell you a funny story before I end for tonight about chanting. This happened in Israel in January of 2020. I was there for the month of January, and we had two pilgrimages there. And the first one, Chanting and I led together, and it was Americans, primarily people from the Palo Alto colony, simply because we filled the whole bus without having to step very far outside our own area. It was great fun. And then most of the Americans went home, and I stayed, and our center leaders from Delhi and our center leaders from Mumbai, Shurjo and Narayani from Mumbai and Daya and Keshava from Delhi came, and they brought with them total of 40 devotees from India. And we also went through Israel and did a whole tour of the places holy to Jesus' life. This was the other side of the East-West Union, was to help our Indian devotees tune in deeper to Christ, and it was absolutely glorious. And God willing, when we can all travel again, we'll do it all again. So one of the places we went was this cave, and the cave held all of us, 40 of us, but pretty full. And it was a cave where John the Baptist had spent quite a lot of time. It was called John's Cave, and it was part of a Franciscan monastery. It was built on this hillside. It was a natural cave built on this hillside, and the monastery was sort of built around it. And it was mostly women in the convent, but there were priests and so on around. Now, one of our American friends, Dambara, who he and I have traveled a lot together, he does a lot of beautiful music. He was doing a lot of the chanting, but it was an Indian group, and they were just more used to the way Shurjo chanted, because they were just more accustomed to him. There's lots of difference. And also, Shurjo often chanted the songs in Hindi, or usually in Hindi. Some of the same melodies, but he chanted in Hindi. So Dambara was at the front of the cave, and Shurjo was at the back of the cave, or the opposite, Dambara was way in the farthest inside of the cave, and Shurjo was the last person in, and I was with him. We were sitting virtually in the doorway of it. There'd been this doorway built over it. So Dambara does some chanting, and it was lovely, but then he passes the harmonium back, and Shurjo takes the harmonium. Now Shurjo's sitting almost outside, and he started with a great deal of energy, and more people got in with him singing. He starts singing one of Master's chants in Hindi. I don't remember which one it was, but it was very dynamic. It was wonderful, like this. But it was also, there was a lot of sound, because there were 40 of us. And then we were just about to meditate. We just finished. And this priest suddenly appears at the door, and he says, the chanting, fortunately the chanting had just stopped. He says, "This is a Christian place," like this, just out of my mouth, and thank you, God. He was tall and big, and he was standing up, and I was sitting on the ground, so I'm like sitting at his feet, and I just looked up and I said, "We're here for Jesus," like that. And I said, "We were about to meditate." "Well, is it going to be a Christian meditation?" he says. And once again, all I could think of to say was, "We're here for Jesus." And unfortunately, what else could he say, So he sort of, just huffed a little bit and asserted his authority and his size a little bit more, and said, I think he said something like, "Well, it better be," or "That's good," or something like that. And then he left. I had so much trouble meditating because I kept wanting to laugh out loud. I just don't know where it came from. And it sort of became the joke for the rest of the tour. We're here for Jesus. Yes, we were there for Jesus, but we were also doing something else that I was glad I didn't have to explain it more. So my friends, that's my last little story about Indian chanting, although it was actually Master's melody with Hindi words, but it was a perfect was perfect in every way. So God bless you, my friends.